February 12th, 1809, in a log cabin on Sinking Spring Farm near Hodgenville, Kentucky, Abraham Lincoln is born. 7 years later, his parents Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln would move north to Hurricane Township, Indiana. Abraham Lincoln grew up a farm boy in poor conditions. His family did not have the money or time to give him any sort of education. Despite this, his love of learning forged him into a bright kid. The farm labor also made him strong and athletic, and his humble background would play a major role in his later political life. In 1831, at the age of 22, Abraham Lincoln moved to New Salem, Illinois, where 3 years later his political career would begin. A political career full of ups, downs, turnarounds, and a completely consistent view on African Americans and slavery. But in order to truly understand Abraham Lincoln and his place in the, spoiler alert, upcoming Civil War, we need to take a little gander at the world that surrounded him, specifically the antebellum North and South. So for now, let's just look at Abraham's politics regarding slavery as of 1837. While Lincoln did not like slavery, he was definitely not an abolitionist. In fact, he was very much against abolitionism. In 1837, Abraham Lincoln presented this protest against abolitionism to the Illinois House of Representatives, condemning abolitionism as fundamentally opposed to the Constitution. Lincoln resolved that he highly disapproved of the formation of abolitionist societies and of the doctrines promulgated by them, claiming that the right to own slaves is sacred to the slaveholding states by the federal Constitution, and that they cannot be deprived of that right without their consent. Okay, now to look at the antebellum South. The antebellum South was undeniably a slave society, meaning that slavery was the core institution of life and all other institutions merely reflected off of it. We find evidence for this in the population census of 1860, which found that about 1/3 of the South's entire population consisted of slaves. In the Deep South, the region of the South characterized by its rich soil that promoted cotton farming, the ratio got closer to 1/2 of every person being a slave. For example, out of the 964,201 people living in Alabama, 435,080 were slaves. In fact, Lee Salto's 1975 book on wealth during the Civil War era found that nearly half of all antebellum Southern wealth was held in slaves. Furthermore, this wealth was by no means equally distributed in the South. This study found that 5% of people in the South owned 67% of the slaves, and the bottom 75% did not own slaves whatsoever. Basically, if you were rich and you lived in the South, you were a plantation owner. This made for an elite planter class that wielded immense power over Southern society. As abolitionist sentiments grew in the North during the antebellum era, the slave owners would change from treating slavery like a necessary evil to arguing that it was a natural part of society and even a positive. Let's look at 3 types of arguments used to justify slavery: social, religious, and pseudoscientific arguments. Southern social arguments argued that slaves were treated better than laborers in Europe or the North. For example, John C. Calhoun wrote, "I hold that in the present state of civilization, where 2 races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relationship now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. I may say with truth that in few countries so much is left to the share of the laborer, and so little exacted from him, or where there is more kind attention paid to him in sickness or infirmities of age. Compare his condition with the tenants of the poor houses in the more civilized portions of Europe. Look at the sick and the old and infirm slave, on one hand in the midst of his family and friends, under the kind, superintendent care of his master and mistress, and compare it with the forlorn and wretched condition of the pauper in the poorhouse." Religious arguments argued that slavery was a natural part of any true Christian civilization. Richard Furman, a Baptist leader from the South, argued that the right of holding slaves is clearly established in the Holy Scriptures, both by precept and example. In the Old Testament, the Israelites were directed to purchase their bondmen and bondmaids of the heathen nations, except they were of the Canaanites, for these were to be destroyed. And it is declared that the persons purchased were to be their bondmen forever, and an inheritance for them and their children. Pseudoscientific arguments attempted to justify slavery by demonstrating the biological inferiority of the black race. For example, this illustration in The Indigenous Races of the Earth by Josiah C. Nott and George Gliddon implies that black people are somewhere in between Caucasian people and monkeys. However, the idea that slavery was in any way natural, or that it somehow benefited its slaves, seemed pretty dubious considering that the Southern slave owners lived in constant fear of slave revolt, born out of a long American history of rebelling slaves. And these fears were fresh in the minds of the antebellum South, with the rebellion of Nat Turner. Nat Turner's rebellion would kill at least 55 white people before it was crushed. Furthermore, for people seemingly convinced of their ideological supremacy, they were pretty desperate to purge any traces of abolitionist rhetoric. A few examples of this are laid out in this paper by Michael Kent Curtis. In 1830, North Carolina, like other southern states, passed a law punishing disseminators of publications with a tendency to incite insurrection or resistance among slaves or free blacks. Alabama's statute provided the death penalty for any person who distributed or published any seditious papers. In 1836, Virginia passed a statute providing for imprisonment of any anti-slavery society member who entered the state and advocated abolitionism or maintained that masters had no property in their slaves. The statute also banned circulating books with the intent of persuading persons of color within this commonwealth to rebel or denying the master the right of property in their slave and inculcating the duty of resistance to such right. This need to prevent the spread of abolitionist ideas within their states was a major factor in Southern secession and the Civil War. Okay, that was a lot to take in, but now we can get back to Abraham Lincoln and the antebellum North. By 1860, the antebellum North had become much more industrialized than its southern counterpart. We can find evidence for this by looking at the number of railroads in the North compared to the South according to the 1860 census. Slavery versus industrialization was the main difference between the North and the South. Where the South had slavery, the North had industrialization. Where the rich and elite of the South were all plantation owners, the rich and elite of the North were all factory owners. While the primary source of labor in the South were slaves, the primary source of labor in the North were workers. And just like the South developed ideologies to justify and defend slavery, the North would develop an ideology to justify and defend industrial labor. This ideology would be called the free labor ideology. And that is where Abraham Lincoln makes his return, because over the course of the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln would emerge as a leader of the new Republican Party, a northern party based on abolitionism and the free labor ideology. Abraham Lincoln played a defining role in the free labor ideology. By looking at how he described the free labor ideology, we can better understand it. Many independent men in this assembly, doubtless of a few years ago, were hired laborers. In their case is almost, if not quite, the general rule. The prudent, penniless beginner in the world labors for wages a while, saves a surplus with which to buy tools or land for himself, then labors on his own account another while, and at length hires another new beginner to help him. This way, say its advocates, is free labor, the just and generous and prosperous system which opens the way for all, gives hope to all, and energy and progress and improvement of condition to all. Men who are industrious and sober and honest in the pursuit of their own interests should after a while accumulate capital, and after that should be allowed to enjoy it in peace, and if they choose, when they had accumulated enough capital, to use it to save themselves from actual labor and hire other people to labor for them. It was right. They did not wrong the man they employed, for they found men who did not have their own land to work upon or shops to work in, and who were benefited by working for them as hired laborers, receiving their capital for it. In short, the free labor ideology was the idea that the labor-capital dynamic was inherently beneficial to both parties. and the assumption that in a free society like the North, someone could earn enough capital to transition from employee to employer. And if the idea that every single worker will eventually become an employer sounds suspiciously like a pyramid scheme to you, then you're not alone, as the free labor ideology received a lot of criticism for being too idealistic and out of tune with the reality of Northern labor. And this is undeniably true to some extent, as this period of American history was marked by corruption, declining wages, degraded work conditions, and the protests, strikes, and boycotts to match. Most of the working class were making only enough money to live off of, if that. This classified these people as wage slaves, people who did not make enough money to actually escape from their condition as workers. At this point in time, around the late 1850s, Lincoln did wish that African Americans could be freed, but he did not believe that black and white people were capable of living as equals. Lincoln wrote, "I should not know what to do as to the existing institution of slavery. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land." He continues, "Free them and make them politically, socially, and are equals? My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, then we know well that those of the great mass of white people will not." Furthermore, Lincoln still did not believe that the federal government had any right to abolish slavery, only to prevent the further spread of slavery, saying, "I will say here, while upon this subject, that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe that I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Never have, never will." 1863. A few years later, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln would pass the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation completely reversed Abraham Lincoln's previous policy on slaves. It immediately freed all slaves in captured Southern territory, with no mention of sending them anywhere outside of America. The goal of the Emancipation Proclamation was to give the North a military edge over the South by freeing its slaves and recruiting them as soldiers. However, its effects would be far greater than that. While many in the North supported total abolition by any means, most people in the North felt that Abraham Lincoln had overstepped his bounds by freeing the slaves in such a radical manner. And furthermore, by not sending them anywhere and leaving them right in America. This was not good for Lincoln, who would have to run for re-election only a year later. The 1864 election for his second term was held during the Civil War, so it did not include the states of the South. However, going into the 1864 election, Abraham Lincoln was more unpopular in the North than ever before. It is likely that Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson, a former slave-owning Democrat from Tennessee, to try to regain the more conservative aspects of America that he had lost. However, Lincoln did not have much hope for his re-election, writing in August 23rd of 1864 that it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. However, Lincoln would be re-elected, winning only a small majority of the popular vote, but dominating the Electoral College. From being intensely against abolitionism and strongly against a mixed-race America to passing the landmark piece of legislation that would empower abolitionism and racial equality, Abraham Lincoln's view on slavery is confusing. It is impossible to know what Lincoln was thinking at the time, and since almost everything we know about him is what he presented to the public as a politician trying to curry favor, it is hard to say whether the opinions he presented were his at all. What is not confusing, though, is the legacy he left behind. Regardless of what he thought about slavery or African Americans, there is no doubt that the Emancipation Proclamation he passed was a crucial step in the path towards racial equality.